My fiancé has postponed our wedding 4 times in 4 years, kindly, each time with a reason I agreed with. Marrying me would have made me a connected person, and a connected person has to be declared. The first one was his mother's hip. That was the September of the first year, 11 weeks out, and Marion Vye went down on a wet path at Corfe and broke a hip at 79, and Dominic sat on the end of our bed at about 1 in the morning and said that he could not stand in a church in the November and be happy with his mother in a chair at the back on morphine, and that he would rather wait and do it properly in the spring. And he cried, "I want that in early, because everybody assumes there was something cold about it, and there never was, not once, in 4 years." He cried, and I held him, and I rang 41 people over the following 2 days and said the words "we've decided to wait," and I meant we, and I have never been able to work out afterwards whether I was lying. The second was the flood. The March of the second year, the house at Chalk had 4 inches through the ground floor, and there is no arguing with that. The third was his father, in the 2nd November, which was a death and not an illness, and there is no arguing with that either. And the fourth was mine, or that is how it was arranged, and that is the one I have gone over the most. In the January of the 4th year I had a scare that turned out to be nothing, and I was tired and frightened for about 6 weeks between 2 appointments, and Dominic said, in the kitchen at Chalk, with real tenderness, that he was not going to let me stand up in front of 200 people while I was waiting for a letter, and that we would go in the summer, quietly, just us, and I said yes, and I was grateful. 4 postponements in 4 years, every one of them true, every one of them proposed by him, first, before I had said anything, and every one of them wrapped around a real event that any decent person would have paused for. That is the shape of it, and the shape is the whole crime, and I did not see it for 4 years because there is nothing to see. It is not a lie. It is a man with the reflexes of a very good auctioneer, who understands that you never have to say no to a thing if you can always find a legitimate reason to say not yet, and who had 4 years of the ordinary catastrophes of a family with elderly parents and a river at the bottom of the garden, and who used every single one of them, and who cried, genuinely on the end of a bed, every time. I have valued ceramics for 19 years. Provincial house, with a national name, 4 Salerooms, about 1,100 lots a month, and my department is the one that pays for the others, English and continental ceramics, and within that a specialism in 18th century porcelain that has taken me my entire adult life and that I would still describe as partial. It is not a glamorous trade, and it is not Antiques Roadshow. It is standing in a stranger's back bedroom on a Tuesday with a torch and a loupe, turning a coffee can upside down, looking at the foot rim and the glaze pooling, and the way the blue has run, and knowing in about 11 seconds whether the thing is Worcester or a Samson copy from 1890, and then spending 40 minutes on it anyway because you have been wrong before. It is telling a woman of 80 that her mother's tea service is worth £200 when she has been telling her neighbors for a decade that it is worth 20,000. And it is writing the condition report, which is the actual product. Everything else in an auction house is theater. The condition report is the only document with any load in it. A paragraph, in the catalog and online, in my words under my initials, saying what is wrong with the object. Restored spout, firing crack to the base, stable, rubbing to the gilding, 2 hairlines, visible under ultraviolet. Old riveted repair, since removed, the holes filled and overpainted. Chip to the underside of the foot rim, 3 millimeters, not visible when displayed. I have written about 40,000 of them, and the thing nobody outside the trade understands is that a condition report does not describe an object, it prices one. 2 identical Chelsea plates, one described as with minor rubbing and one described as with rubbing and a small restored chip to the rim, go for 400 and 2,200, and both descriptions can be true of the same plate, and the difference between them is a judgment made by a woman with a loupe on a Tuesday about how much to mention. 5 things about Dominic Vye, because a man who does this for 6 years is not a cartoon, and the cartoon is no use. He is the best auctioneer I have ever watched, not the showiest, the best. He can hold a room of 200 at 4 in the afternoon on lot 211 when everybody is tired and the good things have gone, and get £100 more than the thing is worth out of 2 people who did not know they wanted it, and he does it by being audibly on their side. He learned my trade for me, not properly, he has no eye, but he read Sandon, and he read Watney, and he asked questions for 2 years, and there is nobody else I have ever been with who has read a book because of my job. In 2020, he drove to Truro at 4 in the morning to collect a single Bristol Delftware charger because the vendor was 90 and would not put it in a van. He nursed his father for the last 11 weeks personally at Chake and did the night shifts and would not have anybody in. And he cried on the end of a bed 4 times in 4 years about a wedding, and I have gone back over every one of those 4 nights about 1,000 times. And my honest conclusion, which I hate, is that the grief was real every time, and so was the arithmetic, and that a person can hold both without noticing the seam. A connected person is a defined term. That is the sentence that ended 4 years, and I read it on a Sunday in the 5th spring at the kitchen table on a laptop for a completely unrelated reason, which is that a colleague was being disciplined, and I wanted to know what the policy actually said before I signed a letter supporting her. The House's conflicts of interest policy is 14 pages. Paragraph 4 defines a connected person as a spouse or civil partner, a cohabiting partner, a parent, child, or sibling, or any person with whom the individual has a close personal relationship, such that their judgment might reasonably be affected. Paragraph 9 says that no director or employee may bid on or acquire an interest in any lot in a department in which a connected person is a specialist, and that all connected persons must be declared on appointment and on any change. And paragraph 11 says the declaration is made annually in writing to the compliance officer and is recorded in a register that is open to the board and to the auditors. A cohabiting partner. I have lived with Dominic Vye at Chalk since 2019. On any reading of paragraph 4, I have been a connected person for 6 years, and no wedding was ever required to make me one, and that is the fact that sat me down on a kitchen chair for about 20 minutes, because if that is true, then the 4 postponements were not about the definition at all. They were about the register. A cohabiting partner is a matter of judgment, and can be argued about, and has never once been tested at that house in 140 years. A wife is a certificate. A wife goes on a line in a register with a date in writing to the compliance officer, and the line stays there, and an auditor reads it, and the moment that line exists, every acquisition in the ceramics department for 6 years becomes a question somebody has to answer. Antonia came in the July, between Osric and November, and she did the emotional work that families like that do without ever having to be asked. Dominic's sister is 52 and runs a garden design business and has been perfectly nice to me for 6 years, and she came to the flat with a bottle and sat down and said she wanted to talk about the wedding. Not about the results, not about Osric, the wedding. And she said that Dominic had told her I had been unhappy about the postponements and that she wanted me to know something he would never say, which is that after their father died, he had not been able to face a church, any church, for any reason, and that he had sat in the car outside the crematorium at Yeovil in the 2nd November and could not get out, and that she had had to go back for him. And that is true. I know it is true because I was there, and I did not know why he was 20 minutes late, and he never told me. So she handed me, in a flat over a glass of wine, a completely genuine explanation for postponement number 3, and she did it in the specific week when I was trying to hold a shape together in my head that had 81 lots in it, and it worked, and I lost about a fortnight to it. That is what the emotional one is actually for, not lying, producing one true thing at the right moment that makes the pattern look like a coincidence again. Lot 41 went to a paddle I did not know. That is the first thing I actually found, and I found it because after that Sunday I did the only thing available to me, which is that I went back through the sale results for my own department. 6 years of them, which is about 70 sales, which is about 9,000 lots, and I did it on the internal system that every specialist can see and that nobody ever looks at, because a specialist looks forward to the next sale and not backward at the last one. And what I was looking for was not Dominic's name, because obviously it is not there. I was looking for a shape, and the shape I found took 4 evenings. Between 2019 and this year, 81 lots in my department were bought by 4 paddle numbers that appear in no other department and at no other house, registered to 2 individuals and a Jersey company, all with correspondence addresses that are a mail forwarding service in Bournemouth. 81 lots, and every one of the 81 has a condition report written by me, and about 60 of them are conservative. I want to be exact about what that means, because this is the part where I am not innocent. Nobody ever asked me to underdescribe an object. Not once, in 6 years, in any form, and if anybody had, I would have gone through the ceiling, and Dominic knows it. What happened is subtler, and I did it to myself. He would come through the department 3 or 4 times a sale, being charming, and he would pick something up, and he would say, "What do you think?" And I would tell him, and he would say HM and put it down. And then perhaps he would say, "I'd be careful about calling that a firing crack. It looks more like a glaze fault to me, and he is not a ceramics man," and he knew that I knew that, and he would say it lightly, as a layman's opinion, and about 1 time in 5 I would look again, and about 1 time in 10 I would change a word, conservatively, if anything. That was his phrase, and he used it perhaps 100 times in 6 years, and it means describe it cautiously, and in an auction house describing cautiously means describing the damage cautiously, and I heard it for 6 years as a compliment about my rigor. The 4 evenings on the internal system are worth describing because it is the only actual investigation in this account, and it was done at a kitchen table with a glass of wine while a man watched the snooker in the next room. The system lets a specialist see hammer prices and paddle numbers for their own department going back to 2016, and it does not let you export, so I wrote 9,000 lots down by hand across 4 evenings, or rather I wrote down the 61 paddle numbers that appeared more than 4 times, and then went back through those. Anybody in that building could have done it. Nobody ever has, because a Saleroom is a machine for looking forward. On the Monday after a sale, the department is already on the next catalog, and the last one has ceased to exist, and that forgetting is not a flaw in the trade, it is the trade, and it is the single most useful property anybody exploiting an auction house has. What made the 4 paddles visible in the end is embarrassingly small. They never bought in the first 50 lots, not once in 6 years across 81 purchases. The first 50 lots of a ceramic sale are the cheap ones, and the room is full, and the trade is watching each other, and by lot 200 the room is half empty, and nobody is watching anybody. And somebody had given an instruction about that in about 2019, and it had been followed perfectly ever since, and it is the only fingerprint in the whole business that was left by a person rather than by a document. Osric Hale has been compliance officer since 2018. He is 62. He is not a specialist and never was. He came from insurance, and his job is to hold the register and to collect 14 annual declarations from directors every February, and to write a paragraph in the annual report saying that he has done so. In 7 years he has recorded for Dominic Vye 7 nil returns, and I have seen them, all 7, because when I finally went to Osric Hale in the June, which was the only wrong move I made, and I will come to it, he showed them to me himself out of a filing cabinet in about 90 seconds. with the mild helpfulness of a man who has never been asked a difficult question in his life. 7 pieces of paper, signed, and on every one of them, in the box that says connected persons, the word none in Dominic's handwriting in 7 different years, including 3 years in which he was engaged to a specialist in the department he was declaring nothing about. Osric Hale is not corrupt. I want to be precise about him because he is the reason it lasted, and because the temptation is to make him a villain, and he is something worse. He is a man who was given a register and understood the job to be the collection of the forms rather than the truth of them, and who has sat 40 feet from a ceramics department for 7 years, knowing perfectly well that the client liaison director lived with the ceramics specialist, because everybody in that building knew, because we were engaged, because there was a card on the notice board in 2021. He did not fail to notice. He noticed, and it did not occur to him that noticing was part of the job, because the form said none, and the form was signed. I went to him in the June. That is the mistake, and it cost me 4 months, and very nearly all of it. I did it because he is the compliance officer, and because I had been raised, professionally, to believe that this is what a compliance officer is for, and I sat in his office with a list of 81 lot numbers and 4 paddle numbers, and I asked him to look at the beneficial ownership of the Jersey company. And he was kind, and he took notes, and he said he would look into it, and he did look into it. And what he did with it is exactly what a man like that always does, which is that he raised it with the person best placed to explain it, and the person best placed to explain it was the client liaison director. I know the date it went to Dominic because of what happened in the house. He came home on the 11th of June, and he was, for the first time in 4 years, not warm, not hostile, careful. And he said over supper that Osric had mentioned that I had been looking at some historical results, and that he wanted me to know that if I ever had a concern about anything at all I could come to him, and that he would rather I did than take it round the houses. And I said I would. And then he said, and this is the only sentence in 6 years that I would call a threat, that he had always thought the strongest thing about my work was that nobody had ever had cause to question a single attribution I had made. Thank you for listening to Channel Crystal Novel, which is true, and which was, I understood in that kitchen with a fork in my hand, an entirely accurate description of what I had to lose, offered to me by a man who had spent 6 years making sure that everything I had to lose was underneath his own arrangement. August was the worst month, and I am going to be honest about it because the version where I proceed steadily from June to November is a lie. After Dominic said the thing about my attributions in the kitchen, I stopped completely. For about 6 weeks, I did nothing at all. I went to work. I cataloged the September sale. I wrote 91 condition reports, and I did not open the system once, and I told myself it was because I was being careful, and it was because I was frightened. And what I was frightened of was extremely specific, and I could have written it on a card, that he was right. That if this came out, the sentence the trade would say about me for the rest of my life is not that Dominic Vye was a thief. It is that Fred Ayling's reports cannot be relied on, and that this would be said by people I respect, and that it would be fair. What ended the 6 weeks was not courage. It was a woman of about 80 called Mrs. Petherick, who came into the department in the 2nd week of September with a Lowestoft cream jug in a Tupperware box, and I looked at it, and it was right, and it was worth about £900, and I told her so, and she cried, in the department, standing up, because she had been told by somebody in a shop that it was worthless, and she had nearly put it in a charity bag. And I walked back to my desk afterwards and thought, entirely clearly, if the reports are not reliable, then that did not just happen either. And I opened the system that evening. The November sale is the one that matters. 340 lots, 2 evenings, and it is the sale the department is judged on, and the star lot was a garniture of 3 Worcester vases, blue scale, circa 1770, from a house near Wincanton, where I had spent 2 days in the February with a torch. They are magnificent, and they have a problem. The central vase has a restored neck, well done, old restoration. invisible under normal light and obvious under ultraviolet, and I wrote that in the condition report in 6 words, and then I sat and looked at those 6 words for about an hour, because by then I knew exactly what I was doing and exactly who would be reading it. Estimate 12 to 18,000. It should have been 40 with a perfect neck, and it was, with that report, a lot that a trade buyer would go to about 14 on, and that a private buyer would not touch. And I did not tell anybody anything. I did not go to the board, and I did not go to the police, and I did not go back to Osric Hale, and I have been asked about all 3 since, and my answer is the same. Everything I had was a pattern and a paddle number, and a pattern and a paddle number in the hands of the specialist who wrote every one of the reports is not evidence of fraud. It is evidence that somebody was buying cheaply out of my department. And the first question any board would have asked, and it would have been the right question, is who wrote those reports. What I did instead is that on the 6th of November, I went to the front desk of my own auction house and registered as a bidder in my own name with my own bank reference and took paddle 209, which is a thing no member of staff has done in that building in living memory, and which is not against a single rule, because the rule prohibits a director's connected person from bidding, and I am the specialist, not the director, and nobody had ever imagined it from that direction. I want to say what the 6 days before that sale were, because everybody thinks the brave part is the paddle, and the brave part was the Monday. I had 18,000 and change, which was all of it, the whole of what I had saved in 19 years of a specialist's salary. And I sat at the kitchen table at Chalk on the Monday evening with the bank app open and Dominic in the next room watching the snooker, and I moved it into the account I had opened in the August in my own name at a different bank. 11 minutes. And then I went in and sat next to him and watched 40 minutes of snooker. There was no plan beyond that. I did not know he would go to 17. I did not know Fenn would look round, and I had no idea at all what I would do if the hammer came down at 15 and I owned nothing. What I had was a number, which is the only thing my trade actually gives you. I knew what those vases were worth with the neck restored, and I knew what they were worth without the report saying so. And the whole of my position was that somewhere between those 2 numbers there is a price at which a man reselling privately cannot make it work, and that if I bid to it in a public room with 200 people watching, he would either have to pay it or stop, and either one was an answer. I sat 4 rows behind them. The Proxy is a man called Callum Fenn, who is a runner for 2 dealers in the Southwest, and who has bought perfectly honestly at that house for 20 years, and who I have known to nod to since 2011, and he had paddle 182, and he sat where he always sits. Lot 41, the garniture, came up at about 9 minutes past 7 on the second evening. It opened at 8,000. It came to Fenn at 13, and he had it, and the auctioneer was looking round the room, and I put my paddle up at 14. I do not think anybody in that room understood for about 90 seconds. Fenn went to 15. I went to 16. He looked round, which they never do, and saw me, and I watched a man of 60 do arithmetic in public. He has an instruction and a limit, and the limit is set by what the thing can be resold for privately, and the resale price depends on the restoration being unmentioned in the trade, and the woman bidding against him is the person who wrote the condition report, and could say anything to anybody at any time. He went to 17, I went to 18, and then he did not bid, and the auctioneer said all done at 18,000 to paddle 209, and brought the hammer down, and I bought 3 Worcester vases with a restored neck for 18,000 pounds of my own money, which was every penny I had liquid and about 4,000 more than they are worth. And then I sat there for the remaining 290 lots, because leaving would have been a performance. The one thing I did on the night, and the only thing I have ever been asked about by the outside firm, is that when I paid for the vases on the Friday, I asked the front desk for a printed buyer's invoice rather than the emailed one, and I asked for it in front of 2 members of staff. It cost nothing and took 90 seconds, and it meant that there existed, in the house's own system, a document with my name and paddle 209 and lot 41 and a date on it, generated by the house, before anybody in that building had decided what the story was going to be. The forensic accountant told me 11 months later that it was the first thing she looked for, and that she had assumed it was advice from a solicitor. It was not advice from anybody. It is what you do in the trade when you want a thing to be true later, and I have been doing it with condition reports since 2007. The review reported in the spring. What happened in between is that Callum Fenn, who is not a criminal and who had never once thought about it, went home and rang the person who instructs him and asked what on earth was going on, and the person who instructs him is a solicitor in Poole who acts for the Jersey Company, and the solicitor rang Dominic, and Dominic did the only thing that could have saved him, which was nothing, and instead he did the other thing, which is that he went to Osric Hale on the 11th of November and filed an amended declaration. 6 years late, in a week when a specialist had just bought her own star lot in open room, he wrote my name in the box. That amended form is the whole case. Everything else in this story is a pattern, and a pattern can be argued with for 4 years by good lawyers, and the house's own review would have taken the view, and told me so, that nothing had been proved. An amended declaration dated the 11th of November, in a register that Osric Hale had kept faithfully for 7 years, sitting immediately after 7-0 returns, is a man writing down the date on which he decided the risk had changed. The board's review ran 11 months, with an outside firm and a forensic accountant, and it found 81 lots, and it found that the Jersey Company was beneficially owned through 2 intermediaries by Dominic Vye, and that the aggregate hammer price of the 81 was £411,000, and the aggregate documented resale was about $2.6 million. Dominic was dismissed in the March and charged in the second autumn with fraud by abuse of position, and he pleaded not guilty and was convicted after a 9-day trial and got 3 years and 4 months. The house itself came out of it worse than anybody expected and better than it deserved. It lost the Wincanton estate and 2 other single-owner collections in the first year because executors will not consign to a Saleroom that is in the papers, and the ceramics department was closed for 11 months and reopened under a specialist brought in from Edinburgh who is younger than me and better than me, and who has, I am told, rewritten the condition report template so that every report is now countersigned by a second pair of eyes. That is the actual legacy, not a conviction. A second signature on 40,000 paragraphs a year in one provincial Saleroom forever, because a woman with a paddle made it impossible for anybody there to keep saying that a specialist working alone is fine. Osric Hale was not charged with anything. He was removed from the compliance role, kept at the house in a different job for 18 months, and retired, and the review's finding about him is one sentence, that the register was maintained as a record of the declarations made rather than as a control. There is a consequence I did not anticipate, and that matters more than any of the rest of it. The 81 lots have owners now. Most of them were resold privately between 2019 and this year to collectors and to 2 dealers and to at least 1 museum on the strength of a condition report with my initials on it that described the damage conservatively, and every one of those buyers has now had a letter. The house did that properly and quickly and at its own expense, and I have no criticism of it whatsoever. 11 of those buyers have brought claims. One of them is a retired GP in Shropshire who paid £41,000 for a pair of Chelsea figures that are worth about 9 with the restoration disclosed, and who wrote to me personally, not through anybody, a page and a half, entirely without malice, asking only whether I had known. I answered that letter. It took me 4 days and 11 drafts, and what I said in the end was that I had not known, that I had written the report myself, that I could not tell him with certainty whether my wording had been influenced, and that I was not going to offer him the comfort of a definite answer I did not have. He wrote back 4 lines and thanked me for not pretending. That correspondence is the only thing from the whole business that I keep. And the thing I actually lost is not in the review at all. Nobody in that trade will ever again take a condition report of mine at face value, and they should not, and I would not. 81 lots over 6 years carry my initials and were bought by my partner's company, and the honest position which the review reached, and which I reached about 4 months before it did, is that it is not possible now to distinguish the ones where I was steered from the ones where I was simply right, and neither can I, and the ones where I was simply right are most of them, and that does not matter. I resigned in the April before they had to decide what to do with me. I have not valued for auction since, and the 411,000 and the 2.6 million and the 3 years and 4 months are, to be truthful, less real to me than a specific afternoon in 2022 when I looked at a bow figure for 40 minutes and wrote a firing crackdown as a glaze fault after Dominic had picked it up and said HM, and I have never been able to establish, in 3 years of going back over it, whether I did that because he said HM or because it was a glaze fault. That is the injury, not the money and not the wedding. A woman who has spent 19 years learning to trust her own eye, and who now cannot audit her own memory of a Tuesday. I have the vases. They are in the front room at the flat, all 3, and the middle one has a restored neck that you cannot see unless you take it into a dark room with a lamp, which I do about twice a year, on no schedule, when I want to look at the one object in the world whose condition I am certain nobody influenced me about. I paid £18,000 for that certainty, which is the most expensive thing I have ever bought, and about which my sister has opinions. My sister asked me once, in the 2nd year, whether I would have married him if he had ever actually set a date and kept it, and I said yes, immediately, without thinking, and then sat with that for about a week, because the honest answer is that I was engaged for 4 years to a man who never once intended to marry me, and I was happy for about 3 of them. That is the part nobody wants, and that I am not going to dress up. It was a good life. We cooked. He was funny about the trade in a way almost nobody is. We went to Lisbon twice, and every single one of those days was inside an arrangement he was maintaining, and none of the days were fake, and I have never found a way to hold both of those that does not feel like a trick being played on me by my own memory. The 4 dates are in a diary I have not thrown away. September the 11th, March the 22nd, November the 9th, and July the 4th, and not one of them happened, and I could still tell you what the flowers were going to be. I do restoration work now, freelance, for 2 museums and a private conservator in Bath, which is the other half of the trade, and the half that cannot be steered, because a crack is a crack under a microscope, and there is no judgment in it at all, and I am busier than I have ever been, and I earn about 1/3 of what I did, and nobody has ever once asked me to describe anything conservatively, if anything. So here is what I want to know from you, since you have been 4 rows back with me the whole way. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next